The Supreme Court chamber was colder than usual, not in temperature, but in tone. The case on the docket wasn't just legal, it was ideological, and everyone knew it. At the center of the storm stood Pam Bondi. The former Florida Attorney General, polished, sharp, unrelenting, had returned to the courtroom, this time not as a politician or pundit, but as lead counsel in a high-profile religious liberty case. Her client, a small, faith-based nonprofit, denied state grants for allegedly blurring the line between church and state. The room was packed. Clerks, reporters, law students, all leaning forward. Everyone knew this hearing would become more than just precedent. It was about perception. Seated above her was Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Barrett's expression was unreadable, her voice precise. A constitutional originalist, yes, but also a guardian of judicial neutrality. To her, belief had to bend to the Constitution, not the other way around. Pam's opening argument was barely a minute in when Barrett raised a hand. "Ms. Bondi," she interrupted, "before we go further, would you agree that government funds should never be used to advance religious belief?" Pam didn't flinch. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I believe in the Constitution's full text, including the Free Exercise Clause." Barrett leaned in. "And does that belief override ethics when public money is involved?" A low murmur rippled through the chamber. Pam's jaw tightened. Her instincts flared. This wasn't just legal scrutiny. It was personal. Barrett continued, calm but pointed. "You've advocated passionately for religious rights, but as an attorney representing the state's interest, how do you reconcile personal conviction with professional duty?" It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. Pam took a breath, and she understood instantly. This hearing wasn't about one nonprofit. It was about her. Barrett was testing more than legal reasoning. She was testing Pam Bondi's integrity, live, on record, before the highest court in the nation. The pressure was immense. But Pam didn't back down, because this wasn't her first trial, and it wouldn't be the one that broke her. Pam Bondi let the silence hang for a second longer than expected. It wasn't hesitation, it was control. And in a room full of scholars and skeptics, silence had weight. "Justice Barrett," she said evenly, "if defending a client's constitutional rights is unethical, then I'd ask, whose ethics are we defending?" The words were calm, but sharp enough to cut marble. Barrett didn't flinch. "This court isn't interested in moral ambiguity, Ms. Bondi. We deal in constitutional clarity." Pam nodded. "Then let's be clear." She stepped slightly forward from the lectern, not to be dramatic, but to be seen. "My client is not asking the government to fund a church. They're asking for the same access to public support as every other nonprofit, because they serve the public." She paused, her voice firm now. "When government discriminates based on faith, it doesn't protect neutrality. It punishes conviction." Barrett's brow arched slightly. "You're implying the state is punishing faith?" Pam didn't blink. "I'm stating it." The courtroom stirred. Barrett leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced. "So your argument is that a religious nonprofit, which teaches scripture and prayer as part of its programs, should receive the same funding as a secular one?" Pam countered without pause. "My argument is that they already serve equally, but are treated unequally." Barrett glanced toward the bench's far end, where Justice Kagan scribbled something. "And you don't see a conflict of interest in advocating for a cause so closely aligned with your personal faith?" There it was. The heart of it. Pam let out a breath, not exasperated, but resolute. "Your Honor," she said softly, "if we start disqualifying people from defending rights because they believe in those rights too deeply, we won't have a justice system. We'll have a thought test." Gasps echoed. The clerk stopped typing for a second. Pam continued, her voice now a little steadier, a little stronger. "I don't stand here in spite of my beliefs. I stand here because I believe everyone deserves equal protection, even if their worldview makes others uncomfortable." Barrett's eyes narrowed, not out of hostility, but curiosity. She had expected defensive maneuvering. What she got was a woman who didn't apologize for conviction, even when it came wrapped in controversy. And for the first time that morning, Barrett didn't reply right away, because Pam Bondi had just reframed the courtroom, and that was only the beginning. For a moment, it wasn't just the justices listening. It was the room, the country, the culture. Pam Bondi had said what few dared to, that belief and professionalism weren't mutually exclusive. That passion didn't equal bias. That conviction could, in fact, be ethical. Justice Barrett adjusted her glasses slowly. The silence on the bench was uncharacteristic. Even Justice Roberts, seated near the center, glanced toward Barrett with subtle interest. Something was shifting. "Ms. Bondi," Barrett finally said, "let's talk precedent." Her tone sharpened, not out of anger but precision. In Locke versus Davey, this court upheld that states could deny scholarships to students studying theology, even if such scholarships were broadly offered otherwise. Why should your client be treated differently? Pam was ready. Because Locke addressed education, she said, not community service. She paced slightly now, only within her designated space, but it was enough to feel like movement, authority. My client runs addiction recovery, after-school tutoring, and food distribution programs, open to the public, regardless of faith. The only difference is, they begin each day with a prayer. She paused. And for that, they're disqualified. Justice Sotomayor looked up from her notes. Even she seemed surprised. Pam continued, her voice unwavering. I'm not asking the state to sponsor worship. I'm asking it to stop punishing it. That line turned heads. Reporters' fingers hovered over keyboards. They could feel it. A quote that would run in headlines by nightfall. Barrett remained composed. So prayer becomes a shield from scrutiny? Pam shook her head. Number but faith should never be a disqualifier. She softened, just slightly, and looked toward Barrett, not as a challenge now, but as a bridge. Your Honor, you know better than anyone what it means to carry faith into public life. You've done it with integrity. I'm asking the court to let my client do the same, without fear of losing their place at the table. The words weren't confrontational. They were undeniably human. Barrett didn't answer immediately, and in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was reflective. Pam Bondi had shifted the focus from constitutional clauses to something deeper. A question every American quietly asks, can I believe something deeply and still belong? And the court, whether it liked it or not, had to answer. Justice Barrett stared down at her notes, but she wasn't reading them. Pam Bondi's final line echoed louder than any citation. You've carried faith into public life with integrity. I'm asking you to let my client do the same. The courtroom held still, not in tension, but in respect. Something powerful had landed, something neither rehearsed nor weaponized, only true. Barrett adjusted her posture, regaining control. Ms. Bondi, she said, voice steady, your words are compelling. But let me ask you plainly, what stops the state from opening a floodgate by approving your client's request? Where does neutrality end if belief becomes a justification? Pam held her gaze. This wasn't the time for legalese. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said calmly, if neutrality means stripping values from public service, we haven't found fairness. We've sterilized compassion. The chamber stirred again. Barrett narrowed her eyes, more intrigued than critical now. Pam continued. If a secular group offers meals and a prayer circle after, they're praised for holistic outreach. If a faith-based group does the same, they're dismissed as missionaries with an agenda. She raised a hand gently to emphasize, not accuse. We can't keep rewriting intent based on whether we like the belief behind it. That's not neutrality. That's selective exclusion. Barrett sat back. This wasn't what she expected. Bondi wasn't just good. She was dangerous. Not because she was wrong, but because she was difficult to argue against without looking biased herself. Even the clerks sensed it. A ripple of whispering passed through the rear bench where law students scribbled faster than usual. Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward slightly. Counsel, he asked. Are you arguing that religious affiliation should never factor into public funding eligibility? Pam didn't blink. I'm arguing that service to the public should be judged by what it does, not by what it believes. Barrett's lips pressed together. For the first time, she had no immediate follow-up. And for the first time, Pam Bondi had the entire bench leaning forward. The hearing was only halfway through, but Twitter was already on fire. Clips of Pam Bondi's sharp responses, especially her calm but stinging line, "I'm not asking the state to sponsor worship. I'm asking it to stop punishing it," had hit the airwaves like lightning. Political accounts from both sides reposted it within minutes. Hashtags began trending. Faith on trial. Bondi vs. Barrett. Is belief bias? Outside the courthouse, cameras had gathered. Cable news stations rolled live coverage. The usual legal correspondents stood shoulder to shoulder with pundits, suddenly realizing they weren't covering a case anymore. They were covering a moment. Inside the Supreme Court, the temperature shifted. Justice Barrett stayed poised, but something behind her composed demeanor had fractured. Not from weakness, but from awareness. Her challenge had backfired, not because Pam fumbled, but because she didn't. Pam had become the story. One clerk leaned toward another and whispered, "This is going to law school lectures for the next 20 years. And Pam? She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She stood still, firm in posture, quiet in tone, but her eyes held a kind of fire no robe could silence. Backstage, in legal chat rooms and journalist group threads, theories exploded. Was Barrett caught off guard? Did Bondi just redefine religious neutrality? Is this the new First Amendment test case? Even Justice Alito scribbled notes more feverishly than usual, his expression unreadable. Barrett took a breath and turned to Bondi again, this time with a slightly softer cadence. Ms. Bondi, would you say that your client's belief system informs every service they provide? Pam nodded. Yes, just as many secular values inform the services of non-faith-based groups. Barrett pressed. And if a group's values are exclusionary, what then? Pam's answer was immediate. Then the law should judge their actions, not their intentions. She added, you can't punish an entire philosophy because one person might misuse it. That's not justice. That's suspicion. Gasps echoed again. Even Justice Sotomayor, usually ideologically distant from Bondi, gave a slight nod. Pam had done more than hold her ground. She had moved the line. And outside, America was watching. Not as spectators, but as participants in a renewed national question. Can conviction and fairness truly coexist? Pam Bondi had just proved, maybe they already do. Justice Barrett's fingers tapped lightly against her bench, a rhythm only those closest to her would notice. Her face, composed as ever, gave nothing away. But behind her eyes, something stirred. She had not expected this. Not from Pam Bondi. Barrett had entered the hearing expecting a passionate conservative lawyer, prone to emotional rhetoric and constitutional cherry-picking. What she faced was different, measured, sharp, unwavering. Pam wasn't playing defense. She was redefining the debate. Ms. Bondi, Barrett finally said, her voice clear but less rigid, do you believe there should be any limits to how faith-based organizations operate when receiving government support? Pam nodded. Yes, limits are necessary when actions violate rights or exclude the public, but that's not this case. She leaned slightly forward. My client hasn't excluded a soul. They feed, clothe, and counsel, often in the places others ignore. The only reason they've been denied funding is because they start their meetings with a prayer. She paused, locking eyes with Barrett. If that's unethical, then we're not protecting the Constitution. We're gutting it. Barrett inhaled slowly. The gavel in front of her remained untouched. For the first time, her silence didn't command the room. It invited tension. Pam continued softly now. I respect this court. I respect you, Justice Barrett. But I will not apologize for believing that faith is not a liability. Not in life, and not in service. The air grew still. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Because this wasn't just about a grant. It wasn't even just about precedent. It was about who gets to belong in the public square. Barrett looked down at her notes, not to read but to break eye contact. Her mind reached back to her own confirmation hearing, to the criticisms, the insinuations that her faith would cloud her judgment. And now here she was, mirroring the same suspicion she once endured. Across the courtroom, Pam stood with quiet fire, no grandstanding, no smirking, only conviction. Justice Barrett adjusted her robe and straightened her shoulders. "Thank you, Ms. Bondi," she said finally, not dismissively but with unexpected sincerity. Pam gave a single nod, and though no gavel fell, the moment felt decisive. Because one thing had become clear: Pam Bondi didn't just argue the law, she held a mirror to the court itself. Just as Justice Barrett prepared to move the hearing forward, a muffled commotion broke out near the rear doors of the courtroom. A bailiff rushed in quietly, whispered something to one of the court marshals, and handed over a folded piece of paper. Justice Roberts leaned toward the message, eyes narrowing slightly as he read. Pam Bondi didn't turn around. Not yet. But the shift in energy was unmistakable. The murmurs, the looks exchanged between justices, the quiet stir among the press bench. Something had breached the courtroom's sacred calm. Roberts cleared his throat. "There's been a public disturbance outside the courthouse. A group has gathered, several hundred from both sides. There have been chants, signs, and, unfortunately, an attempt to breach the steps." Barrett's eyes flicked toward Pam, not in accusation, but connection. She knew. This case had transcended the courtroom. Pam finally turned, subtly, slowly, to glance at the observers in the room. Several wore expressions of concern. Others, thinly veiled defiance. Phones buzzed in silent mode across reporter benches. One sign caught the attention of the clerk who had been glancing toward the doors. "Stop censoring faith." Another, barely visible from the side. "Secular or silenced." Justice Kagan shifted in her seat. Barrett tapped her pen once, not out of habit, but out of focus. "Let's be clear," she said, tone cooler now. "This court is not swayed by spectacle." Pam responded evenly. "Nor am I, Your Honor." But everyone knew, spectacle or not, this case was now viral. The crowd outside chanted both names. Barrett, Bondi. It wasn't just two women on opposite sides of a legal question, it was two visions of America clashing under the marble dome. Justice Thomas, silent until now, leaned into his mic. "Ms. Bondi, do you believe this case has become political?" Pam didn't hesitate. "I believe it's become personal, Justice Thomas. Because people of faith, from any faith, are watching to see whether their belief disqualifies them from serving their own communities." She stepped closer to the lectern, voice lower but stronger. "If that makes people rally outside, maybe we've been silent too long." Barrett inhaled sharply, because she knew this wasn't just a moment for Pam Bondi, it was a movement, and the court was now on trial too. The marble walls of the chamber had never felt so tense. Justice Barrett cleared her throat and leaned into the mic, her tone more deliberate now, almost personal. "Ms. Bondi," she began, "you've argued powerfully that religious organizations should not be excluded from public support based on faith. But what happens when belief collides with pluralism?" Pam looked up. Barrett continued, "What if a publicly funded organization teaches values that exclude others? Or discourages beliefs that differ from their own? Should tax dollars support that?" It was the question everyone had waited for, the strike to the heart of the matter. Pam didn't flinch. Her fingers rested lightly on the lectern. Her voice came low but deliberate. "That's not a question of faith, Your Honor. That's a question of conduct." She paused. "And if we deny support based on what someone might believe, instead of what they actually do, we're no longer judging behavior. We're judging worldview." A few heads nodded. Others stiffened. Pam pressed forward. "My client does not preach hate, They do not exclude. They don't proselytize during public services. They serve food, shelter, education, counseling, with dignity. Their belief informs their compassion, not their discrimination. Barrett's eyes didn't leave hers. And if a group crosses that line? Pam nodded. Then disqualify them. But don't build the line so far back that good people can't even step forward. Roberts leaned toward Barrett slightly as if signaling. That answer was clean. Pam turned toward the full bench. I didn't take this case because it was easy, she said. I took it because I've seen firsthand what happens when faith is forced into the shadows, when people of conscience are told their beliefs make them biased, but silence makes them qualified. She paused again, the chamber heavy with stillness. That's not neutrality. That's censorship with a smile. The phrase landed like thunder. Barrett sat still. So did everyone else. Because there it was. The final turn. Pam Bondi had walked into the Supreme Court as counsel. Now she stood as something more. A woman who didn't apologize for conviction. A voice not just speaking for belief, but through it. And in that moment, even Justice Barrett, silent, sharp, measured, realized Pam Bondi hadn't just made her case, she'd made history. Chief Justice Roberts lifted his gavel slowly, eyes scanning the room. This court will now recess. A ruling will be issued in the coming weeks. Bang! The sound echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap, not from volume, but finality. Justices stood, robes trailing like shadows behind them. Barrett exited without looking back. Kagan whispered to Sotomayor. Thomas walked slowly, thoughtfully. No one spoke to Pam. No one had to. They had heard her. Pam Bondi remained still for a moment. Then she packed her notes, crisp, orderly, calm. No rush, no celebration, just resolve. Outside, it was chaos. Reporters flooded the steps. Microphones shot forward. Pam, did you sway Barrett? What's your reaction to the protests? Are you running for office? She didn't answer. But behind her, someone shouted, She just made Barrett blink! And that was the line that hit Twitter first. By the time Pam reached the black SUV waiting by the curb, Barrett blink and Bondi burn were trending across X, with millions of impressions flooding every feed. Inside the car, her phone lit up. Text from Governor DeSantis. Watched it live. That was masterclass. Another from Franklin Graham. Proud of your courage today. You spoke for many. And from a blocked number, 2 words only. Well played. She knew it was someone from inside. Back at the court, a staffer in Barrett's chambers quietly rewatched the footage of Pam's final words. The phrase censorship with a smile replayed over and over. One clerk looked up and said, She didn't just argue a case. She reframed the whole discussion. Meanwhile, pundits flooded every major outlet. Fox News. Pam Bondi just redefined the religious liberty debate. MSNBC. Dangerous rhetoric or necessary recalibration. CNN. Is faith being put on trial? And across America, regular people took sides. Some posted images of their church service flyers. Others of blank walls where religious murals once hung. Some praised Pam as a constitutional warrior. Others warned that she blurred lines that should stay drawn. But one thing was clear. Pam Bondi had done what no lawyer had done in a long time. Made the Supreme Court feel human again. And she hadn't even delivered her closing statement yet. That was still to come. 3 weeks later, the opinion dropped. 6-3. In favor of Pam Bondi's client. The court ruled that denying public benefits to a nonprofit solely because it is faith-based violated the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. Justice Barrett authored the majority opinion. She cited precedent. She quoted historical frameworks. But one line stood out above all. Neutrality does not require the exclusion of belief. It requires the inclusion of all who serve, regardless of faith. Pam Bondi read it from her office, alone, holding the printed PDF in her hand. She didn't smile. She exhaled. Because she knew this wasn't just a legal win. It was a cultural realignment. News broke within minutes. Media outlets buzzed with opinion pieces and primetime reactions. Bondi reshapes church and state debate. Wall Street Journal. A blow to secular policy. The Atlantic. The woman who made Barrett blink. Time magazine. That afternoon, Pam stepped up to a podium in front of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, reporters, critics, and curious citizens. She wore a navy blue blazer, no podium shield, no teleprompter. She looked out and said simply, "I didn't come here to win. I came here to remind this nation that faith isn't a threat to liberty. It is part of it." A quiet wave rolled through the crowd. She continued, "We didn't ask for favoritism. We asked not to be disqualified for believing. And today, the court said, belief belongs." Behind her, someone held a handmade sign. "Thank you for speaking for us." The cameras rolled. The internet swelled. Politicians scrambled. Pastors quoted her. Activists dissected her. Law professors rewrote their course syllabi. And yet, through it all, Pam never changed her pace. That night, Justice Barrett sat in her private study, reviewing her own words again. Her pen hovered over a new draft for a speech she would give at Notre Dame. She underlined her final sentence: "It is possible to uphold the Constitution without denying the soul." Back in Florida, Pam Bondi framed the printed ruling. She placed it beside her Florida bar certificate. But above them both, in small, engraved script, she hung a plaque that read, "Censorship with a smile." A reminder, a warning, and a line no court would forget again. What started as a courtroom debate ended up shaking the very foundation of how we define faith, fairness, and freedom in public life. Pam Bondi didn't just walk into the Supreme Court to defend a client. She stood for every voice told to hide their convictions. She challenged not just the law, but the comfort zones of power. And when Justice Coney Barrett questioned her ethics, Pam turned the courtroom around with clarity, courage, and truth. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a national mirror, one that asked us all, do we still believe belief has a place in our democracy? In the end, the court ruled. But Pam Bondi led, and maybe that's what history remembers. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More powerful stories are coming, and they just might surprise you. This is Surprising Stories. And today, truth had the final word.